And then the last one is something which politically in the last few months have become very, very important in global politics around development. The European Union, actually, and also the United States, started talking about over the next 12 months developing agreement to deal with this issue separately from CBAM. Worked out the detail yet. There's an important question here because the United States is proposing a framework where they share technology. They're saying it's going to be too hard to bring in a climate charge into the vaccination of coal. But provided they make some sort of equivalent progress in some way, then they should be exempt from CBAM. We're suggesting that CBAM should be changed to a framework that says, yes, you can have bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements. They must not set a lower set of standards than those who sign with CBAM. I think this is a very important building block. The tone of discussions at the moment America does not recognise this is an important issue. If we're going to have a level playing field amongst nations, fair competition is meaningful. The framework we've put through, a 10-point framework, suggests that it shouldn't be possible to have a bilateral agreement that sets a lesser standard than the agreement that is proposed to the rest of the world. That's a broad framework. If you then say, what does this mean for the EU as a whole in terms of CBAM, then the first thing we'd say is you should add in an equivalent contribution exemption. If you make us faster progress in the EU and any of the cascading thresholds, you're automatically exempt from the CBAM. So you have an incentive for nations to compete racing to the top or paying if they fail to move as fast as the EU. The second is something which is before Parliament at the moment, is expand obviously to include all of the actually products at the moment in your ETS, rather than simply the 6 that are there at the moment, which is a major expansion, and include all scope emissions. The challenge that's behind that is a major one, because the administrative load of dealing with working out the emissions for the 6 products that are there at the moment is not very hard, because they tend to be big production plants, there's not a lot of them, and they all have short supply chains. When you go to the 66 products, you have a massive administrative load to deal with. And it becomes a bureaucratic nightmare, unless you put in then exemptions. If you have a mechanism where all those countries that go fast, you have very high transaction costs, there's a strong incentive for countries to move as fast as Europe, rather than deal with the administrative load of tracking where all the emissions are coming and all the scope 2 emissions and putting it all together, product by product. Every time a ton of another product comes in, it has to be reported on. It's a major exercise and major administrative nightmare. Then requiring all of the money to be collected to use to offset emissions somewhere in the world. Clearly, at the moment, there's a debate. A lot of developing countries are looking for a mechanism much like the old clean and development mechanism, but not exactly the same, whereby they can be paid to offset emissions. And having a mechanism that aims to reduce global emissions is very, very important. If leakage and adjustment around the world results in production by countries that are not moving as fast, then you'd surely be better off to actually charge them in a way that reduces emissions. Having an objective concession formula based on some sort of actually formula or threshold is equally important. And if you also actually put in place a rule that prohibits side deals which set a lower standard, but then you have a framework which is consistent with the broad 10 principles we set up. And we think that actually EU would be well served to do that now. And importantly, when we look through the legislation and talking to people in the EU, it would be a very easy set of changes to slot in now, but it would require a significant rethink of parts of it. And importantly, it would give the EU an opportunity to lead on development of a global offset market and to identify and work out a way to trade in offsets which are true offsets. Around the world at the moment, I think there are a lot of fake offsets. People are entering into agreements promising to actually reduce emissions, but that's not actually really actually resulting in a reduction in emissions. And I can show you even in Australia where our government is paying for emissions offsets that actually aren't actually reducing emissions at all. Having a true lock-in framework which is guaranteed to lower emissions is very important. The flip side of all of this, and this is the last part of really the talk that I want to give, is that the need for having a CBAM in Europe is generated by the structure of its emissions trading system. And there's an important question to ask. If you are thinking about the case for bringing in a mechanism to actually deal with leakage caused by an emissions trading scheme, it might be better to change the emissions trading scheme rather than build a whole CBAM mechanism. So the last part of our paper we've put together talks about what the state of the art is in emissions trading schemes. And then from that we can look and see what's missing in Europe. State of the art systems use two, not one market mechanism. They use a mechanism where you trade permits or certificates that are available for emissions for use this year. You also have a mechanism where people can essentially buy the emission permits in the future, or know they're going to get them, by granting what's often called shares or an entitlement of some sort, so you know where you're going. And Europe started doing this. Its free allocation framework sort of did this, but those assets weren't made bankable. The best systems in the world, the state of the art in market trading systems, give people permanent rights to essentially a share of all future emissions that are allowed, and they become a very, very valuable asset. So that a company, who might be a steel company, can look and say, we're going to change from using this production technology to using this one, and know they have the permits in the future to do it. At the moment, there's so much uncertainty that countries and companies are very reluctant to invest. And the solution to this is to issue a framework so people can effectively secure access to future permits and be confident they can do that. The second feature, which comes particularly out of fisheries and out of water management, is to recognise that the reduction pathway might have to vary. The trick in doing that is to issue shares, and so you'll have a share of whatever is issued. If we get to 2030 or 2035 and we need to move faster or slower, the rule is already in place that there'll be a pro rata reduction. So you assign risk and enable risk to be managed. And that provides investment security, which is an important part. None of these features are in the current EU ETS framework. Something else that's talked around the world is the revenue that's collected from the sale of permits and charges around it is recycled. So you collect the money and you pass it back to households and back to regions to actually help them adjust, rather than leaving the money actually in consolidated revenue. You have a bottom-up incentive program rather than the top-down flow of money where politicians get involved. There's this massive advantage, there's strong literature now on saying when you empower communities and you promise them they will receive revenue from the system every year, they plan to use it and they plan to invest. If they have to continuously go back to a central parliament to get access to the money, they don't innovate and they don't plan. Once again, there's a strong argument in the literature and a few examples around the world of where if you lock in actually revenue recycling, you get faster innovation and much more progress. And then the last big point that stands out is the difference between having emissions trading schemes where people have to buy permits and where they're allocated freely. And when you have to buy permits all the time, you're making polluters pay. And the argument about whether one country can force another country to use a specific taxation income mechanism. This is about transfer of wealth, essentially from the shareholders of, for example, a steel company to the people of Europe, rather than about determining the rate of progress. The decision to move from free allocation to making people pay has nothing to do with the rate of progress. It has to do with who receives access to the profits that come from the sale of permits. Let me just close by saying that in the paper we think there's a argument for actually the limitation of these sorts of rules to global problems. We call them actually global environmental border adjustment mechanisms. There's a need to have mechanisms that recognise equivalent contributions, to recognise the role of equivalent price signals, not just one type of thing, which is the sale of permits, to allow for offset actually arrangements globally by firms when it's cheaper than paying actually for the import to solve the problem elsewhere, and to focus on the development of opportunities for offsets, and to make sure there's objectivity in any concessions that are actually applied to LDCs, and finally that there is a level playing field for actually bilateral deals, and nobody's allowed to come back to the EU and say, we have a better plan than CBAM, we want another way of doing it for actually whatever reasons. At that, I think I can probably close and open the floor for discussion, and perhaps some more comments from Peter.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Thank you very much. With technical issues that we had before, I just forgot to present you to provide to all the audience your short bio, even if it was also in our flyer. Mike Young is Emeritus Professor of Energy, Water and Environmental Policy at the University of Adelaide, and was founding executive director of this Environment Institute. He has held the Garth Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University, and is fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. We still have some little technical issue with our colleagues that are in the platform. I think they follow your speech on the streaming instrument, but we'll see if we manage to let them get in the platform for a couple of questions, because we collect a couple of requests in this sense.
I don't know if we can get
so
back. Yeah.
I would like to exploit this opportunity for the moderator to make a question. I have some questions and comments on many inputs you provided us today, but I have this perception. You know, we already discussed a little bit that CBAM is another instrument in an expanding toolbox of increasingly aggressive and assertive trade and industrial policy measures by the EU. Policy measures that have been already adopted. Others are being proposed by the European Commission, and it is not just the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, even the previous one. All of this goes under the label of the Open Strategic Autonomy approach that, in principle, explicitly enables the use of policy responses to unfair and, for example, coercive practices. The objective is to enforce European rights, to defend European interests and values. The Trade Policy Review of the European Commission in 2021 said, while at the same time favoring international cooperation, as we all know, the European Commission wants to maintain that goal at the global level. But I mean, I see CBAM into this toolbox of instruments. There are many other examples. For me, one of the most comparable is the corporate sustainability due diligence. Also there, aims is to foster sustainability and responsible corporate behavior throughout the global supply chains. Or even the dual-use export control regime is another example of comparable instrument in this toolbox of strategic autonomy policy measures. What do you think about this new EU policy trend? What are also the possible implications on the future of the multilateral order and in such turbulent geopolitical context.
Interesting thing. First, if I can say, CBAM, if it gets widened to all of the ETS, is a very broad instrument. It's going to apply to virtually, I don't know what percentage, but probably over half of all the imports into the EU. It's a very, very big change. I haven't done the mathematics to see how it is, but if it's all of the 66 products involved in the ETS, then it's a massive shift. When it's only 6 products, it probably doesn't matter that much how it works out. But if it's a broad one, then it's a very, very different mechanism. Secondly, in terms of due diligence, we found it fascinating in the OECD yesterday talking to people about what this means in terms of data. At the moment, there's a lot of global reporting on data, but it's used to track general trends. It's very, very different if every extra tonne of CO2 that you put into the air costs you money. It's a very, very different proposition. If a steel company has to report and says, oh, roughly 756 tonnes, that's fine. But if 755 tonnes saves you a few $1,000s, then these numbers start to really matter. Similarly, if you have a global progress indicator, the first thing that the EU is going to want to do is to check whether or not a country is using an acceptable set of standards in reporting to the UNFCCC. And immediately then, as a result, you find a very important question around what's included in the bundle of reporting. Australia, back in Kyoto, fought very hard and succeeded to have built into the accounting framework recognition of the impacts of land use change and forestry on emissions. Only a small number of countries in the world are trying to estimate changes actually in emissions as a result of land use change, including soil carbon. So is Australia allowed to get exemption because if it includes land use change and recognises offset from increased forestry, is it allowed to do that when another country that's not collecting that data misses out on that opportunity? So all this data changes the loose global cooperation on reporting to something that has to be auditable. So there's a major change that comes out of this. And setting these standards has to be really worked through. And that's all part of the toolbox. So all these other agreements matter. That's the sort of it's a very important issue.
Yeah. Peter.
Thanks, Roberto. So just in response to your question, in essence, your question was, is it just another trade defense measure? And if so, what are the implications for the rules-based trading order, the WTO? I would say it's not just another trade defense measure. It is partly a trade defense measure. So in Brussels on Monday, and again to some extent at the OECD in Paris yesterday, we heard, well, there's a climate emergency and something has to be done. And what the EU is doing is it's responding to that climate emergency in a way that nobody else is. So we are actually doing the world a favor by putting pressure on the system. And this is another example of what many trade economists would call the Brussels effect. Taking EU legislation, putting something together, in this case CBAM, previously it was GDPR, you mentioned a couple of others in your introductory remarks, and then rolling them out, and the rest of the world just has to adjust. And the system adapts and it moves on. And there's also other multilateral precedent for this, I would argue. If one thinks of chlorofluorocarbons, for instance. Remember those back in the 70s and 80s, the debates about CFCs, those refrigerants, the gases in your fridges, amongst other things, aerosol cans and so on. That led to the Montreal Protocol, ultimately to a multilateral solution. So if anything, it ended in a multilateral agreement. That's what motivated us in writing this paper, because that's what we're anticipating, that the EU is going to put its design in place. It is putting its design in place, no matter what we say here. Then the next question is, how do you take that design and translate it into a multilateral context? Can you translate it into a multilateral context is the underlying question. So I don't think it's incompatible with multilateralism. It certainly challenges, but potentially in a positive way, I think.
But it's also interesting on that to notice that the UK, Canada, the United States, Malaysia, and I think Japan have now all said they're going to set up some sort of border adjustment mechanism at government level. And they've started the journey to work out how to design it. So very quickly we're moving from one trading group doing this to having a family of trading groups. And there's a very interesting debate going on about whether or not there should be a club. And Germany, separately from the EU, has said we should form a club. And the question is, what are the rules for entry into the club? And I guess the obvious one that comes out of if you bring in a global mechanism exemption process, as we've suggested, then all countries that meet that standard are part of the club. So the way you join the club is to move as fast as the EU's moving, and then you're part of working out the fine print around how you go forward and how you deal with all the tensions around it. But I think this is a very, very interesting time, and likely as a result of what's happening, to really progress difficulties associated with dealing with tensions between trade and the environment. This has really become a global challenge now. It's been recognised globally as something that has to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you both. We are now seeing our colleagues in participating through our platform.
Oh, gone again.
Yeah.
Andre, would you like to ask a question? I can see you there.
You've seen who? Professor Bollino, I've seen. Also our colleague Bocconi, Luca Berardini, exactly, from Bocconi. We've seen you, our colleague is helping us, is assisting us on this technical issue. In the meantime, I would ask to all our colleagues here in the conference room, thanks again for your participation. If you want to comment or make a question to our guests, please feel free to raise your hand. I know that raising hands is becoming an old style thing, but yes, you are allowed to do so. I'm happy to see both students and colleagues. And Luca Ballardini, Carlo Andrea Bollino, thanks for connecting. I hope you had the opportunity to follow the presentation of Professor Young through our streaming platform, because the streaming, the Zoom was enabled. Also for you, if you have any comments or question, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, after. I have another question for Professor Young. You mentioned the issue of developing countries. Yeah. The fact that we need to think about how to deal with countries in different development stages, and different also stages of mitigation policies and so on and so forth. In terms of actual recommendation for the design of multilateral CBAM. What you suggest? Just exemptions, like recognizing a special and differentiated treatment as for them for other reason at the WTO level.
Yes, I do think it would have to be formal recognition. I've played around with a little bit looking at this, but I would think one of the building blocks would be GDP per capita, and there'll be a threshold. So countries that have a greater than a certain amount of GDP per capita, we can argue what that is, would not be entitled to actually any exemption. Now, you could weight that by some sort of measurement of capacity to deal with change. You can work one out. Then the second question, and then there are two ways you can provide assistance. One is you can have a percentage reduction on the amount that has to be paid. So while a country like Australia would have to pay the full cost of acquiring the certificates in Europe, a country which is a developing country might only have to pay 80% or 70% and having a sliding scale on that. So you can have that. You can also have recognition provided you make an acceptable rate of slower progress. So at the moment, the rate of progress you would expect would be something which plans to get you to net zero by 2050. But you might say for groups of countries that they actually have until 2060 or 2070, you'd work out the difference in the wedge and you'd give them a percentage based on where that is. So there are two ways of doing it. One is lesser payment, and the second is a tolerance of a slower rate of progress. Coupled with that, when you get in, this is going to be, I think if it becomes law, will become a very important feature. If a country gets 1 or 2% behind the EU because something happened for 1 year, are they allowed to have a catch-up? So is there some sort of margin in there? And it's a very, very important question. You could say that there's a tolerance that provided you're at least 95% as great a contribution as the EU's making, then that's okay for a period of time. But whatever is put in place, it has to be objective and not subject to selective negotiation. If the aim of this is to deal with climate change, keep it purely about climate change. Don't use it to deal with other issues, like, for example, actually whether or not you support action on actually Russian invasion of the Ukraine. A lot of trade policy ends up being mixed up in these broader issues. This is a global problem. Keep it as a global instrument and don't use it for actually other issues.
Peter, I don't know if you want to add something to the fact that I somehow I'm being provocative, mentioning special and differentiated treatment. We know that not always it worked as we expected, so we have an history on that, record on that. So if you want to add something.
So in the WTO, we call it special and differential treatment for historical reasons that have to do with the WTO. In the UNFCCC context, we call it common but differentiated responsibilities, but it's the same concept. It sounds nice in principle. Now, the way it works in the WTO is there's two levels, really, to how SDT works. So the first level is all LDCs have automatic exemptions. So if you're an LDC, which is an officially recognized UN category, then you will get certain considerations, and there's a range of them. So you could just carve out LDCs. That might just be one approach and say, well, they're really poor, poorest of the poor. They should just be exempt automatically, period. That could create incentive problems, right? So why not take your steel plant and put it in an LDC which is exempt, maybe good for the LDC, not good for the global problem. You happen to fix the leakage problem. The second problem really is around measurement. And in the WTO context, this has been a hotly debated issue. I'm personally a fan of coming up with objective criteria. But which objective criteria? And nobody's got an answer to that question. And this really comes down to how you define what it means to be developing, and then how you categorize countries into different categories of developing. And which criteria are you going to use? So if we just use GDP per capita, for example, my favorite example, I come from Africa, I'm South African, I know about the African realities more or less. Equatorial Guinea is a country with 600,000 people, more or less. It exports one thing, which is oil, and it has a very high per capita GDP. But all of that oil wealth is controlled by one family, and that family is pretty small. So if Equatorial Guinea, if you just use GDP per capita as a measure, it would probably be included in the net, and because it's an oil producer, it probably should be. But the population is dirt poor, totally underdeveloped, no prospects for development. So how do you deal with these kinds of anomalies, given the problems with data? And I don't think anybody's got an answer to the question. We actually have a proposal on the table that we're shopping around to say, well, let's put a group of very smart economists together, not just economists, development people, who really look at this problem from many different angles and come up with some suggestions to the WTO. That's our target. So there's not a simple answer to it. In principle, I agree with Mike that in practice, it's a very difficult thing to achieve.
The alternative is not to offer any concessions at all, which is the way at the moment CBAM is structured. So there is no clear process other than the hint that there could be a opportunity for separate agreements. And the only separate agreement that's on the table at the moment is actually with one of the wealthiest, actually in the world, the United States.
Yeah. We oh. Yeah, I was just saying that we're running out of time, but we have time for a quick question. I don't know if our colleagues participating virtually, Andrea or Luca wants to intervene, or our colleagues in the audience participating. Okay. Andrea, we can hear you.
I think he's saying no.
Oh, it's okay? No, just, Andrea, do you want to make a question? No, okay, perfect, thanks. Thanks for participating. And oh, yes. Just one thing, they cannot hear you. Okay.
That's okay. So let me go straight to a really good example. At the moment, Europe builds a lot of ships with steel that's imported sometimes from other countries. If you bring in a CBAM, one of the consequences could be that the ships are built outside, because the price differential then becomes greater, because rather than importing the steel, which is expensive, say, oh, we're not going to do that, and as a result of that, shipbuilding moves outside the EU. These are some of the perverse consequences of putting any threshold price in place that people adjust. I think that's the greatest risk while the coverage is small. When you go to longer supply chains than the current ones that are being talked about, then it becomes administratively very, very complex to work out what the real emissions are. The way CBAM is worked out at the moment, it's only emissions at the factory that's making the product. And if you look at the products that are on the list, they're all monitored very effectively and quite efficiently because it's large volumes. You can get, you can say to a steel factory in India, you're importing, exporting steel to Europe. You want to do that, you have to have careful account of your emissions on that factory and brought in. Interestingly, the other side of this is that the price of certificates inside the EU varies week by week and month by month, and there's a requirement that the purchase of the certificates occurs at the time the product comes into the EU, which is different from the price when it's made. There could be a 3 or 4 or even 6 month delay from when the product is made to when it's brought in. And there'll be arguments if there's shifts and swings in prices over whether it should be at the time when the emission occurs. I'm actually rather than at the time when it's brought into the EU. These things that are swings and roundabouts unless there's a pattern in them.
Other questions? I think we already abused for some day. Luca? Oh, yes, now I see. You raised your hand virtually.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, and thank you, Professor Yang, for your really...
now we are not hearing you. You opened your microphone? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
It's just a problem of our
System.
Okay.
Luca, ask you to, if possible, to write down your question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Let's try like that. Perché c'aveva... Parlano ma non li sentiamo. Parlava? No, siamo tutto l'audio è sulle casse.
He's typing. Why don't we?
No, quello è. Okay. Yeah, for those of you that probably cannot read it, first of all, thanks to Professor Young for his useful insights. Luca Bellardini would like to ask, how would CBAM be implemented in a context where banks' capital requirements were tied to the greenness of their lending projects, so-called green supporting factor? Thanks in advance.
The first thing that happens around this is it becomes much easier to work out what's green because there's going to be a much careful global tracking of what's going on for companies outside the EU. So it'll make no difference inside the EU, but outside it'll do it. The other thing that starts to happen out of this is that the demand and incentive to trade in green products becomes much greater. So factories, what you expect is factories that are green will be trying very hard to supply their products to the EU rather than to somewhere else in the world because they will be exempt the CBAM payment and therefore will be able to receive more for their product. So this starts to develop and expand a market and a demand and opportunity for green products. So you'd expect this to expedite progress, which is part of the reason why the EU is doing it, and I applaud them for doing that. To the extent that it causes product shifting, it becomes interesting. If it also brings greater certainty to the design of the emissions trading systems that are used in the EU, then arguably that also starts to bring greater clarity. And one of the biggest measures of the greenness of a product is actually how much emission certificates you have to buy. It's very easy once you have this sort of mechanism in place to look to a factory and say, are you green? And the test is, do you have to buy emissions permits? And if the answer is no, then you're 100% green. So all these starting to move from using independent measures, which are people claim, I've already said in Australia, there are a lot of people claiming to be reducing emissions when in fact they're not really doing it. They can get somebody else to certify that they are green, and in one sense they are, but we're moving towards a framework that's a lot more bankable. So a bank can say, we will lend you a green loan provided you don't have to buy any emissions permits.
Yeah, it's very interesting how the interaction between the increasing role for example, central bank in terms of requirements and regulation for greening investments, and at the same time we'll still seeing how a push is coming from the demand from the market with, for example, the ESG principles that are becoming more and more influential.
We've just done an experience in water. I've had a lot of involved in setting up fisheries markets and water markets to actually manage scarcity, and it's very interesting to see the challenges associated with having to deal with people who cheat. Australia made a practice of going as far as putting people in jail. It's a criminal offence to falsify records. There are very strong incentives to falsify records. If you're having to pay for emissions and you find a way to hide it, then you do. And there are very strong incentives to pay bribes to auditors, etc., to get behind this. So it's a massive change, which is important and supports the banks in dealing with all of this. They want to have something which is bankable, not something which is corrupt. It lifts the whole climate change algebra to another level, provided governments come in behind it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the participants, and especially thank you very, very much to Professor Mike Young and to Professor Peter Draper. Thanks for being here in Rome, for being part of this seminar of the Department of Business and Economic Science at Guglielmo Marconi University. This was the occasion to present your paper on Institute for International Trade of the University of Adelaide working paper. You can find the link in our flyer, in our webpage, in the news of our Guglielmo Marconi University webpage related to the event. Thanks again. Thanks to all the participants. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
And actually, if anybody wants the slide deck, they can have the slide deck.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, so there are no problems with passing that on to others.
Yeah, for sure. This could be very useful for some students that are working on CBAMs on their thesis, and this could be interesting. But the paper per se is something I will share.
Yeah. We hang up.
Yeah, we can close all these.
someone else can work that out.
So you have